There are people who spend their entire lives waiting for permission. Permission to speak, permission to rest, permission to feel what they actually feel instead of what they're supposed to feel. They move through the world like actors who've forgotten they're playing a role, so committed to the performance that they can no longer remember who they were before the curtain rose. You might be one of them. And if you are, you probably don't even know it yet. Because living for others doesn't announce itself with grand declarations. It doesn't arrive as a conscious choice. It seeps in quietly through 1,000 small surrenders. Through the times you said yes when everything inside you screamed no. Through the dreams you abandoned because someone else found them impractical. Through the parts of yourself you learned to hide because they made other people uncomfortable. And here's what nobody tells you about this kind of life. It feels noble. It feels like love. It feels like maturity, like wisdom, like the natural progression of a good person becoming better. You convince yourself that self-sacrifice is the same as selflessness, that putting everyone else first is what it means to be kind, that your own desires are somehow less important than the comfort of people who would never make the same sacrifice for you. Until one day, you wake up, and you realize you've become a stranger to yourself. Thomas Merton understood this paradox. He saw how easily we trade our authentic existence for the approval of a world that will never be satisfied. How we construct elaborate prisons out of other people's expectations and then wonder why we feel so trapped. He knew that the greatest spiritual crisis of modern life isn't the absence of faith in something greater, but the absence of faith in our own right to exist as we truly are. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from living for others. It's not the tiredness of hard work or physical labor. It's deeper than that. It's the weariness of maintaining a self that isn't really yours, of performing emotions you don't feel, of defending choices you never wanted to make, of building a life that looks perfect from the outside while feeling hollow from within. You meet people at parties and they ask what you do, who you are, what brings you joy. And you recite the answers you've been given, the career that made your parents proud, the relationship that looks good on paper, the hobbies that seem appropriate for someone your age, your background, your position in life. You speak these words, and they sound right, they sound convincing. But somewhere deep inside, a voice you've been ignoring for years whispers a single question. Is this really me? And that's when the danger begins, not in the question itself, but in what happens when you start listening to it. Because once you hear that voice, once you acknowledge that whisper of authentic self beneath all the layers of performance, you can't unhear it. It grows louder, it becomes more insistent, it starts pointing out all the places where your life doesn't match your truth. I knew someone once who spent 40 years becoming exactly what everyone expected: a successful career, a good marriage, children who exceeded every milestone. From the outside, this person had won at life, had checked every box, had built the kind of existence that others envied. But inside there was this growing emptiness, this sense of having climbed a mountain only to discover it was the wrong mountain entirely. And the terrible thing wasn't the wasted time. It wasn't even the life unlived. It was the realization that this person had become so skilled at being who others needed them to be that they no longer knew who they actually were. The performance had consumed the performer. The mask had merged with the face. This is what Merton meant when he spoke about the false self. Not the self that sins or makes mistakes, but the self we construct to survive in a world that demands conformity. The self we build from borrowed dreams and inherited fears. The self that exists only in relation to others, that has no substance of its own, that disappears the moment the audience leaves the room. And here's the paradox that tears people apart. Living for others feels like the right thing to do. Society rewards it. Religion often preaches it. Your family depends on it. Your friends expect it. Your entire social structure is built on the assumption that you will continue to play your part, to fulfill your role, to be who they need you to be. So when you start to pull away, when you begin to reclaim your authentic self, it doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like betrayal, like selfishness, like failure. The people who benefited from your self-abandonment suddenly become concerned about your well-being. They tell you you're going through a phase, that you're being irresponsible, that you're changing in ways that worry them. And they're right. You are changing. You're becoming real. But real feels dangerous when you've spent your whole life being safe. Real feels reckless when you've built your identity on being reliable. Real feels selfish when you've defined goodness as the erasure of your own needs. There's a story I once heard about a bird raised in a cage so small it couldn't spread its wings. When someone finally opened the door, the bird didn't fly out. It stayed perched on its familiar bar, occasionally glancing at the open sky with what might have been longing or might have been fear. The cage had become its entire world. Freedom itself had become the threat. We do this to ourselves. We build cages out of other people's expectations, out of societal norms, out of our own internalized shame about wanting what we actually want. We make these cages so familiar that they start to feel like home. And then when someone suggests we could leave, we find 1,000 reasons why we need to stay. The job may drain your spirit, but it pays the bills. The relationship may lack passion, but it's stable. The life may feel empty, but it's respectable. And besides, think of how many people would be disappointed if you changed course now. Think of how much you've already invested in being this version of yourself. Think of how frightening it would be to start over, to admit that you've been living someone else's dream while your own withered from neglect. But here's what happens if you don't make that shift, if you don't claim your own life before it's too late. The resentment starts small. A flicker of irritation when someone makes another demand on your time. A flash of envy when you see someone living authentically, doing what they love, being who they are. You tell yourself these feelings are unworthy, that you should be grateful for all you have, that other people have it worse, and maybe they do. But their suffering doesn't make yours less real. The resentment grows. It spreads like a stain. It colors every interaction. You start to hate the people you've been living for, even though they never asked you to sacrifice yourself. You become bitter about choices you made, even though nobody held a gun to your head. You feel trapped by obligations you created, imprisoned by expectations you internalized, suffocated by a life you built with your own hands. And the cruelest part is that you can't blame anyone else, because nobody forced you into this cage. They just left the door open, and you walked in voluntarily, believing that self-imprisonment was the price of love. Merton wrote about this extensively in his later years, about how we confuse ego death with self-destruction, how we think that becoming spiritual means becoming nothing, erasing ourselves completely, sacrificing every desire on the altar of service. But that's not transcendence. That's just another form of ego, wrapped in the robes of false humility. True spiritual maturity doesn't mean living for others at the expense of yourself. It means living from your authentic center, from the place where your true self resides, and allowing that authentic presence to naturally serve the world. Not because you should, not because you're trying to be good, but because a person who is fully alive cannot help but contribute something real. When you live from your false self, from that constructed identity built on others' expectations, your service becomes hollow. It may look impressive. It may even help people in practical ways. But it lacks the vital energy that comes from genuine presence. It's mechanical, dutiful, empty of the spontaneous joy that marks authentic giving. But when you live from your true self, even small acts carry weight. A simple conversation becomes transformative. A moment of presence becomes healing. Your very existence becomes a form of service. Not because you're trying to serve, but because authenticity is inherently generative. It creates space for others to be authentic too. I remember watching a man discover this truth. He'd spent 30 years in a career that paid well but numbed his soul. Everyone depended on him, his family, his employees, his clients. He couldn't imagine walking away. The guilt alone seemed insurmountable. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly. But gradually, he began making small choices aligned with his actual desires. He started painting again, something he'd loved as a young man but abandoned as impractical. He began saying no to obligations that drained him. He stopped pretending to enjoy social events he found exhausting. His family noticed. They worried he was having a crisis. But what they saw as breakdown was actually breakthrough. He was finally becoming himself after decades of performance. And here's what surprised everyone, including him. As he became more authentic, he didn't become more selfish, he became more genuinely generous. Because when you stop giving from obligation and start giving from overflow, the quality of what you offer transforms entirely. It's no longer duty, it's not sacrifice, it's the natural expression of a life being lived fully. This is the great inversion, the great reversal of everything we've been taught about goodness and service. We think we must diminish ourselves to help others. We believe that our needs and their needs are in competition. We imagine that living for ourselves means abandoning everyone else. But that's the logic of the false self-talking. That's the ego in spiritual disguise, convincing you that your suffering makes you noble, that your self-erasure makes you loving, that your misery is somehow morally superior to your joy. Merton saw through this lie. He understood that a person who has abandoned themselves has nothing real to offer anyone. They can offer their performance, their sacrifice, their exhaustion, but not their presence, not their truth, not the irreplaceable gift of who they actually are. And the world doesn't need more performers. It doesn't need more martyrs. It doesn't need more people slowly dying inside while maintaining a smile on their face. What the world needs, what it's starving for, is people who are actually alive. People who know who they are. People who have made peace with their own existence and stopped apologizing for taking up space. When you stop living for others and start living for yourself, something unexpected happens. The people who truly love you don't abandon you. They celebrate your awakening. They may be confused at first. They may need time to adjust to this new version of you. But real love doesn't require your self-betrayal. Real love doesn't need you to be smaller than you are. The people who get angry when you start living authentically were never loving you anyway. They were loving what you did for them. They were attached to your role, your function, your usefulness. And when you step out of that role, when you stop functioning according to their needs, they experience it as a loss. But what they're losing isn't you. It's the version of you that never existed anyway. This is perhaps the most painful revelation of authentic living. You discover that some relationships were built entirely on your willingness to abandon yourself. Remove that willingness, and the relationship dissolves. It turns out there was nothing else holding it together. But this dissolution, as painful as it is, creates space for something real, for connections based on mutual presence rather than mutual need, for relationships where both people are encouraged to be fully themselves, for love that doesn't require anyone to shrink. There's a period of grief in this transition. Even if your false self was a prison, it was a familiar prison. Even if your old life was suffocating, it was a known suffocation. The unknown always carries fear, and when you step into authentic living, you step into vast, unknown territory. Who are you when you're not performing? What do you want when you stop wanting what you're supposed to want? Where does your life go when you remove other people's directions from the map? These questions don't have easy answers. In fact, they may not have answers at all in the beginning. You might spend months, even years, in a state of uncertainty, feeling your way forward in the dark, learning to trust your own inner compass after a lifetime of following external directions. This is normal. This is necessary. This is what it actually means to become yourself. Merton spent years in a monastery before he understood this. He thought he was escaping the false self by leaving the world, but he discovered that you can't escape yourself through geography or circumstance. The false self follows you anywhere. It puts on robes, it performs piety, it constructs spiritual narratives to justify its continued existence. The real work isn't about where you are or what you're doing. It's about the quality of presence you bring to your existence. It's about whether you're living from the inside out or the outside in. It's about whether your choices arise from your authentic center or from your accumulated fears about what others might think. And this work is never finished. You don't arrive at some final destination where you're permanently authentic and never slip back into performance. Life continually presents new situations that test your commitment to yourself. New people who want you to be someone you're not. New pressures to conform. New temptations to abandon your truth for the sake of comfort or approval. But each time you choose yourself, it gets a little easier. Each time you honor your authentic desires over inherited expectations, You strengthen your connection to your true self. Each time you risk disapproval by being real, you build the muscle of genuine presence. And slowly, something shifts. You start to notice that the anxiety you carried for so long begins to ease. Not because your life becomes perfect, but because you're no longer at war with your own existence. You're not constantly judging yourself against some impossible standard. You're not exhausting yourself trying to be everything to everyone. You're just being yourself. And that turns out to be enough. More than enough, actually. Because when you stop fragmenting your energy across countless performances, when you stop trying to be who everyone needs you to be, you discover reservoirs of vitality you didn't know existed. Life becomes richer, more textured, more vivid. Colors seem brighter. Conversations feel deeper. Simple pleasures that you overlooked for years suddenly reveal themselves as profound. This is what Merton meant when he wrote about contemplation. Not as some esoteric practice reserved for monks, but as the natural state of a person who has stopped running from themselves, who has learned to simply be present with what is, without constantly trying to fix it, change it, or perform for it. Contemplation is what happens when you finally exhale after a lifetime of holding your breath. I've watched people go through this transformation. It's not always graceful. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it involves difficult conversations, painful endings, uncomfortable truths. Sometimes people lose things they thought they needed. Jobs, relationships, identities they'd wrapped themselves in for decades. But I've never seen anyone regret it. Not really. Because even in the midst of the chaos and uncertainty, there's this unmistakable quality of aliveness. This sense of finally coming home to themselves after a long exile. This relief that comes from no longer having to maintain an exhausting performance. One woman told me it felt like removing a heavy costume she'd been wearing so long, she forgot it wasn't her skin. When she finally took it off, she felt naked, vulnerable, exposed, but also lighter, more herself, more real. Another person described it as waking from a dream. They'd been living on autopilot for so long, going through the motions, checking the boxes, following the script. And then something happened. A crisis, a loss, a moment of unbearable clarity, and suddenly they were awake, aware, present in their own life for what felt like the first time. These awakenings don't always come gently. Sometimes they arrive through suffering, through the accumulation of years of self-betrayal reaching a critical mass, through your body finally refusing to cooperate with a life your spirit has rejected, through depression, through illness. Through the complete collapse of the carefully constructed false self you've been maintaining. But however they arrive, they offer the same invitation to finally stop living for others and start living for yourself. Not selfishly, not at the expense of anyone else, but from your authentic center, from the place where your unique gift to the world resides. Because here's what they don't tell you about authentic living. It's not selfish. It's the opposite. When you live from your true self, you have something real to offer. Your presence becomes a gift. Your very existence becomes a form of service. Not because you're trying to serve, but because authenticity is inherently valuable. The world has enough people living half-lives. It has enough people going through the motions. It has enough people who have forgotten who they are beneath all the roles and performances and expectations. What the world needs is you. Actually, you. Not the version you think you should be, not the person others want you to be, not the carefully curated image you present to the world. Just you, raw, real, alive, present in your own existence without apology. This is the great work. Not building a perfect life, not achieving some impressive goal, not accumulating wealth or status or recognition, but simply becoming who you actually are and having the courage to live from that place, regardless of who approves or disapproves. Merton spent his entire adult life wrestling with this question. He was a famous monk, a best-selling author, a spiritual teacher admired around the world. And yet, in his private journals, he confessed his ongoing struggle with the false self, with the temptation to perform spirituality rather than live it, with the gap between his public image and his inner reality. He wasn't a saint who figured it all out. He was a human being trying to be honest about the difficulty of authentic living. And maybe that's the real teaching, that this work isn't about perfection, it's about honesty, about the willingness to keep returning to your truth even when you've strayed from it, about choosing yourself again and again, in small moments and large ones, until that choice becomes your natural way of being. There will be days when you slip back into old patterns, when you say yes when you mean no, when you perform instead of being present, when you abandon your truth for the sake of keeping peace or avoiding conflict, or maintaining some relationship that requires your self-betrayal. This is human. This is normal. This doesn't mean you've failed. The journey toward authentic living isn't linear. It's spiral. You circle back to the same lessons again and again, each time from a slightly different angle, with slightly deeper understanding. You think you've learned to stop people-pleasing, and then a new situation arises that triggers that old pattern. You believe you've claimed your voice, and then you find yourself silent in a meeting, swallowing words that needed to be spoken. This is the nature of transformation. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, in waves, in small shifts that accumulate over time into something you can finally call freedom. And the beautiful thing about this process is that it teaches you self-compassion. Because when you see how hard it is to break patterns you've been rehearsing your entire life, you develop empathy for your own struggle. You stop expecting yourself to be perfect. You learn to celebrate small victories instead of focusing on failures. Maybe today you only managed to set one boundary where you would have set none before. Maybe you only spoke your truth in one conversation where you would have stayed silent. Maybe you only honored one desire where you would have sacrificed it for someone else's comfort. That's enough. That's progress. That's you, slowly, courageously, learning to occupy your own life. There's also something to be said about the loneliness of this path. Not everyone will understand your transformation. Some people will interpret your self-honoring as self-centeredness, your boundary setting as coldness, your authenticity as arrogance. This misunderstanding is part of the cost, and it's not a small cost, because humans are social creatures. We're wired for belonging. And when you step out of your assigned role in the collective, when you stop playing the part everyone expects, you risk exclusion. But here's what you gain: integrity, the ability to look yourself in the eye without flinching, the peace that comes from alignment between your inner truth and outer expression, the quiet dignity of a life lived on your own terms. What matters is whether you notice, whether you catch yourself in the act of self-abandonment and gently bring yourself back, whether you can forgive yourself for being imperfect and keep moving toward greater authenticity anyway. Because living for yourself isn't a destination you reach, it's a practice you cultivate. It's a series of small choices made moment by moment, day by day, year by year. Choices that honor your truth even when it's inconvenient. Choices that protect your energy even when others want to drain it. Choices that preserve your integrity even when conformity would be easier. And over time, these choices accumulate. They create a life that actually feels like yours. A life where you wake up with energy instead of dread. Where your days have meaning that arises from your own values rather than inherited obligations. Where you can look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. This is freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want without consequences, but the freedom to be who you are without permission. The freedom to occupy your own life fully. The freedom to stop waiting for some external authority to validate your existence. In the end, living for yourself isn't about abandoning others. It's about showing up authentically so that your relationships can be real. It's about having something genuine to offer instead of just your exhausted compliance. It's about being the kind of person who inspires others to live authentically too, simply by your example. Because when people encounter someone who is genuinely alive, who has stopped performing and started being, something in them recognizes it. Something remembers. Something wakes up. Your authenticity gives others permission to find their own. Your courage to be yourself becomes an invitation for them to do the same. Your refusal to live a half-life challenges them to examine their own compromises. This is the real gift, not your sacrifice, not your performance, not your exhausted attempts to be everything to everyone, but your presence, your truth, your willingness to take up space in the world as exactly who you are. And taking up space doesn't mean being loud or aggressive or demanding attention. It simply means allowing yourself to exist without apologizing for it. It means not shrinking to make others comfortable. It means trusting that your existence has value even when you're not producing, performing, or pleasing anyone. This is radical in a world that constantly tells us our worth is conditional, that we must earn our place, that we must justify our right to rest, to refuse, to choose ourselves. But what if your existence needs no justification? What if you don't have to earn the right to live according to your truth? What if you've always been worthy, always been enough, and the only thing standing between you and that recognition was your willingness to believe it? Merton wrestled with this question his entire life. He struggled with the gap between the contemplative ideal and the messy reality of being human. He knew what it meant to live authentically in theory, but the practice was something else entirely. It required constant vigilance, constant recommitment, constant courage to choose truth over comfort. And yet he kept choosing it. Not perfectly, not without stumbles, but persistently, until that choice became the defining characteristic of his life. This is all any of us can do. Keep choosing. Keep returning. Keep recommitting to our authentic path, even when it would be easier to slip back into performance. So stop waiting for permission to live your own life. Stop apologizing for your desires, your needs, your truth. Stop shrinking to fit into spaces that were never meant to contain you. The people who love you will adjust. The people who can't weren't really loving you anyway. And the life that's waiting for you on the other side of this fear is more real, more meaningful, more satisfying than anything you could build by abandoning yourself for others. This is what Merton understood in his final years. That the spiritual path isn't about becoming less human. It's about becoming more fully yourself. That holiness isn't found in self-erasure, but in self-realization. That the only thing you have to offer the world that no one else can is your authentic presence. And when you finally claim that presence, when you finally stop living for others and start living for yourself, you discover something unexpected. You discover that this was always what the world needed from you. Not your sacrifice, your life. Fully lived, fully claimed, fully yours. And in that claiming, in that courageous act of self-ownership, you become exactly what you were always meant to be. Not perfect, not admired by everyone, not free from struggle or doubt or moments of uncertainty, but real, present, alive. And that, in the end, is the only thing that matters. That, in the end, is everything.